Dr. Arvind Panagariya. He's of course been appointed recently as the chairperson of the 16th Finance Commission. Many congratulations again, sir. Kindly join us on stage. It's wonderful to have you. He's of course also a celebrated author and a globally respected economist. I'd request Shelly Chopra to please join us on stage to take this conversation forward. Namaskar.
Shall we say welcome back to India?
Yes, thank you.
And we had some amazing music short while ago, which I saw you thoroughly enjoying. So I'm very curious, is Mr. Arvind Panagariya into music? And what kind of music is he into?
Mainly the old songs, you know, the Kishore Kumar, Mukesh, Rafi, Lata. So I'm from the old generation, so mostly it's still stuck in there.
Stuck in time, you said?
Yes.
Lovely. Luckily, our economy is not, and Mr. Panagariya is at the helm of now the new Finance Commission. Very curious. Coming back into India, seeing it from the heart of Columbia University, then being here at Niti Aayog and launching its new avatar, going back, you've seen India in many colors, both in global context and its own context. How do you feel about the comeback right now?
Well, for me, coming back to India has always been invigorating, and no surprise that even after I had returned from the Niti Aayog back to New York, I was coming about 3 times a year at least. So I can't stay away from India. And after 50 years, I'm still an Indian citizen. So, you know, this year it'll be 50 years in the United States for me. I left in 1974.
Yes.
So.
But you know, there is so much optimism about India today. Every single person, from our timelines to our newspapers to any form of text, is talking about the India story. And it's not just about relative to the world. Of course, everything is relative. But having seen India from the outside and now building these, you know, executing a lot of new ideas, which we'll talk about as we go, what is making you excited about the India story today?
So give me just a minute, you know, to give you a little background of me, because I'm old. So I have seen the old India and I'm seeing the new India. And I remember, you know, in the 1980s, I used to be very pessimistic about India, that this license permit Raj that we have will probably never go away. We even used to joke that, you know, economists who work on India are of 2 types, those who are optimists and those who are pessimists. And the pessimist says that things are so bad, I can't imagine them getting any worse. And the optimist says that, well, I can. But things changed in 1991. And since then, you know, we had ups and downs. But nevertheless, I think, you know, the trend has continued to be towards liberalization with some bumps along the way. And as a result, the growth has been kicked up. For about 20 years, we have now grown about 7% a year in real rupees. But if I make the same calculation in real dollars, we have grown about 8% for 20 years. And if I take out the COVID years, it's 8.8% in real dollars. So that's hell of a growth. You know, we could have never imagined in 1980s that this could happen. So I think, you know, things are looking very good. And when one looks to the future, it looks even better.
One of the parts of the topic of this afternoon includes the term jobs. And everyone who talks about the India growth story talks about amazing numbers that makes everyone euphoric about the potential. But every time we attach the word jobs with it, it doesn't always seem to add up. Does this add up for Arvind Panagariya?
Okay, yes and no. I think yes, in the sense that, you know, a lot of the jobs debate happens around unemployment. And if you look at the serious surveys, which is the, you know, PLFS, the labor force survey that the MOSPI does, your employment rates are not very high. Whether you look aggregate urban unemployment, rural is even less, and aggregate, it has been around between 3 and 4%. So unemployment is really not India's problem in my view, and we can talk about it. Our problem is underemployment. So productivity is low. So the job that can be done by one person often gets done by two people or maybe three people. And that is where I think, the real challenge of jobs is creating well-paid, high productivity jobs.
So unpack that for us. You said unemployment is not a problem. The problem is underemployment. I'm just looking at just the number of women who are employed. This number was 25% or 27% a few years ago. We've actually dropped on that number. I'm just curious, as a whole, when you say that underemployment is a problem, somebody could argue that we just have more people employed in the same job or pretending to do that job. Could you just unravel that for us simply, as an economist, think of us as students and tell us why do we have this situation?
So one way to think of it is this, that we are a country with a very large workforce, right? So in the economist jargon, we'll say that we are a labor-abundant country and we are a capital-scarce country. But what we have done is to put much of the capital in very selective sectors, which are in any case very capital-intensive. So we got a situation where much of the capital is working with very few workers. And then you got a host of workers in agriculture, in micro and small enterprises, where the capital is hardly present.
Yeah.
So then you got a lot of workers working with very little capital.
Yeah.
And when that is the case, it translates into low productivity.
Yes.
Right? So even for a gardener, for example, if you haven't got the proper tools, he's not going to be able to do the job efficiently.
Yes.
And so you substitute labor for capital, but there are certain forms of capital which cannot be substituted
Yes.
by labor. So that translates into low productivity.
But this is a fantastic point you make, and it's a realistic point. My question to you is that how are we fixing this? Because it's clear to us that there's no dearth of capital when you can show growth like the growth figures we're talking about, and it's coming through in FDI and coming through in financial institutional capital. But that's not the answer to creating jobs.
Yes, I think this is where you're right. The capital is sufficiently there, meaning our savings rate now has climbed back up, and total investment to GDP ratio has come back to about 34% now, which is, from the peak that we experienced, very unusual in 2007-8, is only 2 or 3 percentage points away. So we are very much there in terms of total capital. What is still happening is that this capital is sitting in industries which employ very few workers. What we need is policies, and part of this problem has been very historical. We started out with incredible kind of license permit Raj on industry. So industry was very shackled. We opened that in the 1990s, but the small scale industries reservation remained. Then the labor laws still have not been reformed. We have passed the labor laws, four new codes, but they have still not been implemented. So, what that of course translates in is that capital really doesn't go where labor is, because think of industries like apparel, footwear, furniture, all kinds of light manufacturing, which all the countries that have grown at 10 or 11%, South Korea, Taiwan in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, China in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, they all exported these products in large volumes. We haven't done that. Yeah. And I think, we still need to fix labor laws, need to fix infrastructure. I think infrastructure progress has been absolutely tremendous. Phenomenal, actually, I should say, in the last 4 or 5 years. But again, we do need to fix the labor laws. Some trade issues also, because we have sort of compared to other countries, our protection level is higher. That needs to come down. So I think, nevertheless, on the whole, we are in a fantastic sweet spot. These are problems I think will get sorted out, and over the next 10 years, I'm very optimistic that the jobs problem will be solved as well.
So, Mr. Panagariya, we last met in 2007-8, on the steps of Columbia University, and I still remember that we were talking about labor law challenges. We are in 2024. We're still talking about labor law challenges. Are we just disillusioned about solving this? Is this something that we have moved the bus from? Because you said capital doesn't chase labor-intensive spaces. Is it time for India to wake up and say, manufacturing, I haven't got it right, I've missed the bus, let me now build on something else? Just curious. I mean, we're actually entering an era where the entire country is talking about semiconductor chips. And a large part of the world has moved on from it. So I'm very curious about your very honest thoughts on these.
Look, just quickly on the semiconductors, there is a different argument, and that's a more national security kind of argument, that you don't want to get caught up in a situation in which you don't have access to semiconductors.
Okay.
So perhaps you could argue about that. But there is no escaping manufacturing. I think it's nonsensical for anybody to say that you can grow the economy on services. Name one country on the face of the earth over the last 150 years which has actually grown and transformed itself without manufacturing.
Then what makes you hopeful now, in 2024 about India? Why will we get it right now?
In India, the reforms have been piecemeal. That is the challenge. Within a democracy, there are a lot of strengths, but it is also the fact that you have to take the people with you. And so the reform process tends to be slow. There is no question about it. You can draw the contrast between India and China, for instance, that, after Mao died in China, Deng Xiaoping came along and he said things were not quite right. That's not the way it ought to be. And with the authoritarian system, Deng Xiaoping went in and bang, bang, bang. I mean, he also faced internal opposition, but it still was nothing like what our political class have to face when they make changes. We saw that happen in the case of the farm laws, for example, which had to be ultimately withdrawn. So it is a slower process. Our politicians also understand it, so they do try to evolve some consensus first, and then bring the reforms. And labor law clearly was, remember that Mr. Yashwant Sinha, during Mr. Vajpayee's prime ministership, had first put the labor law reform on the table, but at that time, then he couldn't build the consensus, so he took it off. And subsequently, I think no other government had taken the courage, but now the Modi government has gone ahead and passed at least the laws. So, I think it'll happen. I mean, now the laws have been passed. The difficult part has been done. It's only that some of the states are dragging their feet in writing the rules and regulations, because laws cannot be implemented without every state writing the rules and regulations, because the old laws have to be repealed. Yes. Now, you can't repeal the old laws. These are central laws. You can't repeal the old laws for 22 states and not for the other 6 states. Yeah. So therefore, they have to be implemented in all 28 states simultaneously, and that process is ongoing. For most of these codes, most of the states have actually written the rules and regulations. Just 2 or 3 states left. It'll happen as soon after the elections.
So given that the Indian economy has always sort of waited for these disruptive moments, the leapfrog story, what do you think is going to be your 2 biggest priorities in the new role as you look at the India story, perhaps at yet another pivot in the global market?
Yes. Now, in my new position, I think it's a very different job. This is not directly related to the reforms. It has to do with the division of tax revenues between the center and the states and among the states. So this is really, a very low-key.
It's almost a political job, by the way.
It is turning a little more political, you could say, but largely I think the history of finance commissions has been that it is a very professional body, keeps a low profile, and it does its job. And in the end, I think, it has enjoyed the general acceptance from all political parties, and it has never resulted in any kind of political storm, so to say.
Yes.
So I hope we can do the same. So not from my side, but I think I can tell you what reforms perhaps we will need to do going forward. So I've already mentioned the labor laws which have to be implemented. We then also need to liberalize the economy a bit further. I think on this issue we have, particularly in 2018-19 fiscal year, because the GST revenues had declined in the early stages, now they are back. In 2018-19, we introduced a lot of custom duties. I think, the original motivation was to compensate for the revenue lost on GST, but then the protection has this habit of not going away that easily, once the tariffs are put in place. So I think we need to liberalize those. We need to also sign more and more free trade agreements. We have done some with Australia, UAE. The one with UK, it looks like it may even happen before the elections are concluded, but certainly after elections will happen. We have to also sign one with the European Union, and I would really love to see down the road, it will not happen within next 3-4 years, but down the road, once we do it with the European Union, we should be ready to sign one with United States as well. So that's one last very important set of reforms have to do with privatization. And on that, the government already has a good policy in place for privatization of public sector enterprises, but also a lot of the banks ought to be privatized as well. So this is the kind of set of reform agenda that the
Just
new
on that
government will
point,
have to-
could you talk a little bit more about it? I mean, we've seen some conversation on the banks. We've seen some privatization of government institutions. Are you looking at a specific sector, let's say within banking, outside banking? Just curious. And what makes you optimistic about this divestment? Is it because now there are other private sector organizations that are doing better, in those spaces? Just curious. Or unlocking money, basically.
No, look, I mean, unlocking money is also important actually,
Yes.
because, the government does want to invest a lot more on infrastructure, and it is doing it incredibly effectively. The projects that used to take 10 years are being completed in 2 years now. And projects on large scale, the kinds of projects we had never done, we are doing those. So that is a reason also. But I think even bigger reason is one of efficiency, that, once these enterprises pass on to the private hands, they all become far more productive than they were. I mean, look, Air India is a prime example. The government was losing billions of dollars on Air India actually every year. Those losses have now gone off the government's books. And in addition, I've been traveling Air India since it was privatized, and I've never seen, the plane being even 1/10 empty. I think every seat is taken, both in the economy class, business class. It's at least the flight that I come on from JFK to Delhi, completely full. Service is improved, image is improving, and that in spite of the fact that the interior of this particular plane on this particular leg of the flight is still an old one, but that hasn't deterred, but this is the history also of, I mean, this is the more recent one, but several enterprises had been privatized under Prime Minister Vajpayee.
Yes.
And every single one of them actually is flourishing. And employment, there's always this bogey is raised that, the private owner will fire the workers, and employment, jobs will be lost and so forth. None of that happened actually. Systematic studies have been done. Employment has gone up, and of course the enterprises themselves have taken off.
Yes, in divested entities. Okay, let me just zoom you out of that and talk to you about how today India has a place in the world. And of course, it's very much so driven by that 7 to 8% growth, because where else do you put the money and get growth, right? But I wonder what your take is when you see that not only are we showing financial returns to the world, we're showing a voice of confidence. Has that struck you as a very important difference between the last 4-5 years to where it is today, and how?
Yeah, practically all the good things that could happen are happening. And in the opposite side, we sometimes say that the conditions are there for a perfect storm. Now the conditions are perfectly there for India to take the world by storm. Economically, really India is the only major economy that's growing at this kind of rate. The rival economy, China, which had been growing very robustly for about 3 decades, I would say,
Yeah.
has slowed down. I mean, there's no question. The fourth decade, if you take 2010's decade, growth rate has come down to about 7% during that decade. And currently it is